So I've also changed the title a little bit. It is June 27th, 1844, and Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has been martyred by a mob. Brigham Young becomes the next prophet and leads the saints on Exodus to the Salt Lake Valley. So simple, right? If you were to read the church's official website, you might get that impression, with sentences like, Brigham Young succeeded Joseph Smith right after the latter was killed. This insinuates that this transitional period was as smooth as it was quick. Many members might be shocked to hear that it took 7 months for Brigham Young to assume leadership officially, and between the martyr and the first pioneers leaving Nauvoo was astounding 588 days. This transitional period was a delicate era for the church, for in the wake of Joseph Smith's martyr, could have dissolved the religion as a whole, as expected by some newspapers. The church still had to deal with the crisis of leadership, the continued persecution by mobs and government, deal with the day-to-day running of the city of Nauvoo, and amongst all of that, prepare a mass exodus for the United States. For such a crucial period of the church's history, the story of these 20 months have seemingly fallen through the cracks in popular history. So this neglect begs the question, what was the church up to from June 27th, 1844 to February 4th, 1846? So I would say the lack of understanding on this historical period is understandable. In the past, as mentioned in some of the other presentations, the church has had a policy of keeping a lot of its historical records under lock and key. Leaders like Boyd K. Packer wanted to advance only faith-promoting material. I would argue that this has led to the propagation of folklore and myth surrounding this early period. So I'm happy to see that the church has reversed this stance in recent years, culminating with the Joseph Smith Papers project. The church's effort to publish all related primary source material, and this included the Council of 50 Minutes, the record I will be closely examining today. Joseph Smith wanted the Council of 50 to take care of political and civic matters in the city of Nauvoo, which was the church's headquarters. Therefore, looking at the Council of 50 meetings will best help us to understand the church's political actions during this time. The historiography, I would say, that was written about the Council of 50 prior to the Joseph Smith Papers is lacking in some specificity. The Mormon history scholar Klaus J. Hansen, in his 1967 book, Quest for Empire, which was one of the first books to be written about the Council of 50, mentions in his essay on sources that he had no access to these minutes. Because these meetings were kept a secret, scholars had to piece together any details from newspapers, journal entries, and any unauthorized leaked information. As a result, many things fell through the cracks. As an example of this was in the definitive biography on Brigham Young published in 2010, which makes no mention of the meeting which he was proclaimed to the prophet by the council. More on that later. Therefore, the addition of this primary source material will go on to enhance our understanding of this era and correct any previous mistakes, omissions, and myths. Since we'll be looking at a specific time frame, I thought a humble little timeline would be best suitable for demonstration. This is a close-up of the time in question. So the Council of 50 meetings had 4 distinct phases. Phase 1, I will not comment on extensively, as this took place before the martyr, but for our purposes, you only need to know that the impetus for the meetings to begin in the first place was to discuss this relocation effort. After the martyr, there was a considerable scramble of church leaders in Nauvoo to figure out what to do, so thus started the succession crisis, a period of time when it was unclear who would lead next, of which 9 claimants, major claimants, came forward, some starting churches that still exist to this day. I will not go into too much more detail on the succession crisis because the Council of 50 was only ever indirectly involved. So after a weird 47-day period of meetings and debates, the Quorum of the 12 took control and reorganized leadership. So the Quorum of the 12 was another governing body of the church, but it focused more on ecclesiastical concerns. However, the 12 and the Council of 50 did overlap. All quorum members were also members of the council. I've created a little complicated chart to kind of help you explain the differences here. Therefore, the council's political legitimacy, I would argue, in Nauvoo gave the 12 legitimacy in its ecclesiastical duties, which gave Brigham Young, the president of the quorum, de facto presidential status. The quorum with Young at the head would continue leading in a semi-official capacity, setting the church affairs in order for several months. The official end of the succession crisis came at a Council of 50 meeting on March 1st. Brigham Young was officially proclaimed the prophet unanimously by the council, giving it a unique role to play in his ascension. And as mentioned previously, this event seems to have been unknown to previous scholars. Phase 2 is when the power of the Council of 50 does come into play. At the end of January, the state of Illinois revoked the city charter of Nauvoo. This left the Saints without any governance for a population of 12,000, which, for context, made it larger than Chicago at the time. The church was already intertwined with city officials, therefore the council was well positioned in Nauvoo to become the shadow government. The revocation put the church back on high alert, and meetings would continue because of it. Protecting the Saints from violence did become the major concern of the Council of 50, and this took 3 forms: the commission of weapons, allying with American Indians, and, of course, the pending Exodus. The Council's focus on obtaining weapons was the least focused of the 3 because it was clear that they wanted to avoid a war, so I'll only touch on it briefly. The talk of collecting funds was first mentioned on April 11th, and the first round of guns were delivered by May 10th, showing that they moved quickly. However, state officials came to Nauvoo in search of illegally stolen goods, which this was interpreted by the Saints as an attempt to locate the weapons to press charges against the leadership. After this, relocation efforts would be expedited, but more on that later. The Saints were particularly interested with the American Indians, specifically with alliances and conversion. The Saints found common cause with the Indians, as both groups received persecution from governments, like with the Indian Removal Act and the Mormon Extermination Order. Indian proselytization was first discussed at the very first meeting, and the Indian convert Louis Dana did join the council to help assist in their council's efforts. When the council learned of an upcoming pan-Indian council, they sent a delegation to kind of float to the idea of this Mormon-Indian alliance. Ultimately, few conversions or a concrete alliance was ever made, but the tribal discussion enveloped much of the council's early efforts. So now, let's discuss the Exodus. Joseph Smith initially organized the council in 1844 to plan the relocation effort, so it was important from the very beginning. However, the Exodus dominated discussion in phases 3 and 4. Some of the greatest folklore about the Exodus, which I used to believe, was that the Saints were unexpectedly fled from Nauvoo after they saw an oncoming mob, and then they wandered around aimlessly for a while until eventually they got to Salt Lake. But as sources reveal, every step of the Exodus was planned in advance. Parties were sent out to locate possible places, which were all deliberated on. Leaders consulted reports for the Rocky Mountains from explorers. Properties in Nauvoo were sold in advance, and provisions were set aside for the journey. They even publicly announced their departure in Nauvoo newspapers months in advance, so anti-Mormon mobs would leave them alone. The Saints had a few considerations when choosing a location. They wanted to specifically be outside the United States because of persecution. They wanted a lot of land for growth, defensible geography, like with mountains, and they wanted a place that was disease-free because Nauvoo had malaria. So a couple of the locations that were considered was the independent Republic of Texas, the disputed Oregon Territory, and Upper California, which is the name for the vast northern territory of Mexico, which did include Utah. The location of the Great Salt Lake was determined as early as September 9th. The last 4 meetings in January were entirely about final preparations. Young insisted that many of the wagon trains be on high alert, ready to leave at a moment's notice, as they were afraid of the federal government intervening. The first party finally left Nauvoo on February 4th, thus starting the Mormon Exodus. As the Council of 50 reveals, many important things occurred during this period. I didn't even have time to mention the temple. I didn't have time to mention the Nauvoo House's financial troubles, the numerous political petitions that the council put forward, and the wolf problem. This source, while almost 200 years old, feels so brand new, and the scholarship around the Council of 50 and this 588-day period is only just beginning. Thank you.